The ego is a very dangerous thing.
Hey, mate.
Hold up, before we get started.
1968. A time of revolution, a time of various other happenings around the world. Amidst the chaos, however, Damon Albarn and Jamie Hewlett were born. The former on March 23rd, and the latter on April 3rd. For Damon Albarn, music made up most of his childhood. His household was filled with countless foreign sounds gained from a set of parents with artistic backgrounds and bohemian mindsets, alongside his sister Jessica, who would learn to play the piano, violin, and guitar, but would mainly take interest in music composition. Proceeding to flunk out of a primary school, Damon would attend Stanway Comprehensive, where he'd meet Graham Coxon singing with him in the choir, someone who had a similar passion regarding music. Damon and Graham would play little shows together for school, and would become closer and closer.
I started really sort of writing songs when Graham and I started our first band, which was called Real Lives. Yeah, the first songs I ever wrote, we performed at, I remember it vividly, at our school assembly at 9 o'clock in the morning, which was a bit of a baptism of fire, really.
After graduation, Damon would briefly swap gears and attend the East 15 acting school. Drama was his passion at Stanway, and he thought continuing on this pathway was the right idea, but it didn't work out and he dropped out after the first year, returning home in 1987. Despite being in low spirits and considering himself the worst actor in the world, music became his passion. He'd perform on the keys a couple times, once as a solo performance and once with some band called the Alternative Car Park. Albarn then took a part-time music course at London's Goldsmiths College, coincidentally the same place Graham was studying, and during this time he was more than a bit miserable. He was living life out on the dole, doing acid and drinking booze. However, a £3,000 inheritance from his grandfather gave him the opportunity to record a demo tape. He took this tape to the nearest studio to his workplace. Damon Albarn, at age 19, walked into the recently formed Beat Factory and would start recording there in the dead of night in exchange for serving tea by day. Damon would attempt to record a variety of sounds in this early stage. He'd be described as a musical chameleon by co-founder and engineer of the Beat Factory working there, the late Graham Holdaway. Damon was just throwing stuff on the wall and seeing what stuck. It was the growing pains era for him. Through this, he briefly created a group called Two as a Crowd alongside member Sam Vamplew. The partnership didn't last too long, however, and after a spare handful of weeks, the group fell apart. Guess the soul ska synth sound didn't work out. An enigma would occur while Damon was burning hot with passion. He'd do a solo performance backed by college friend Tom Aitkenhead at the Colchester Arts Centre, with tape loops, sequencers, and synths acting as their tools. One of the 10 people that attended was Graham Coxon, and another one of the 10 was his friend Dave Rowntree. Graham and Dave go way back. Dave was a drummer friend of his that played in a million small bands, some of which involved Graham. Eventually, Dave shipped himself off as a computer controller and general geek, but he stayed in touch with Graham. Damon would continue to work in the Beat Factory, making jazz punk demos and eventually recording them under the band name Circus, comprised of himself, Tom on guitar, songwriter and acting schoolmate of Damon's Eddie Deedigan and his mate Dave Brolin on bass, and Darren Filkins. Eddie and Darren were both prior from the Alternative Car Park, however Darren left and Damon was the one that filled in for his role for the concert in 1986 that I mentioned earlier.
You two take care of labor.
Only intended for a plane capsule.
You don't want to die.
Speaking of, this gig is one of those weird oddities in Damon Albarn's career. It remains completely undocumented and lost in terms of audio and video, and was actually an opener for Nico of the Velvet Underground. The Alternative Car Park had technically already split up by this point, but they had agreed to reunite to perform on November 19th at the Gold Diggers Club in Chippenham. Damon didn't even know who the Velvet Underground were before he was offered to open for them, but of course he took a liking to them and took part in this opener. He also premiered a proper composition of his own titled The Rain, a well-received but ultimately lost start to his songwriting career. Circus recorded some stuff together and put it on tape. It just so happens Graham picked up one of these tapes and showed it to Dave, who asked Graham to put his name into Damon's mind for him. Circus became a merry-go-round of members as various people left and entered. Tom Aitkenhead left the crowd early on, and Darren Filkins left to pursue professional photography the eve of projected recording sessions and went on to have a very prolific and successful career, while Dave filled in on drums and Graham Coxon would finally join in on the ride on saxophone, before wowing literally everyone in the studio by showing he was also very good at guitar. That leaves us with the quintet of Damon, Eddie, Dave, Graham, and Dave. So where do we go from here? Well, first, a mini album for potential labels was recorded and mixed. This was cause for a big celebration. A party was of course called for. Graham invited some of his mates to celebrate, one of which being someone named Alex James. Alex was a fellow member of Goldsmiths, studying French and living right underneath Graham. They hit it off quite well. Alex could play bass decently, and besides composing songs together like I've Lost My Balls Inside My Computer, they were good mates. So he was invited to the party, where he met Damon and the crew for the first time. Damon showed Alex some of Circus's songs, and Alex thought they were god-awful. Damon and Dave, on the other hand, thought Alex was a bit arrogant and annoying. But hey, Circus had an album, so what now? Conflict Island is where we head to. Damon and Eddie were at arms with each other as lead songwriters. Damon would tend to have his songs recorded the most, but Eddie was good at getting the last word in. Eventually, this would come to a head at a gig the Beat Factory had managed to organize. In between performing their now recorded and mixed tunes, Damon and Eddie got into flippant arguments on stage. The after-show showdown between the manager of the Beat Factory, Mariah Bergkamp, alongside Graham and the band after the gig was harsh. Tensions were high between the band following this concert, and after a rather slight comment in the studio from Roundtree about how Damon was really the songwriter for Circus, Eddie and Dave would pack their bags and turn Circus a triplet. So our trio of Damon, Graham, and Dave needed a bassist. Luckily, Graham had a name in his head, Alex James. Despite being a non-mate of Damon's, Alex James would show up on bass and join the Circus. Well, only really because Damon had keys to a recording studio. The newly formed quartet then changed their name to Seymour. Their first session together on the 18th of December 1988 produced their first song together, a ditty titled She's So High.
Well, it's 89 really, it all
Yeah.
starts.
Did you have all the songs ready? Did you know what you were
Well, remember we were Seymour,
Yeah.
and Seymour was it was just a real sort of art school. I mean, we were serious, but it was all over the place. We were sort of trying a different thing every time we rehearsed, you know. But I suppose that the essence of it was play fast, loud music and jump around a lot and do it to the point of exhaustion and then get completely pissed and then start again the next day.
Seymour would play various pubs and parties throughout 1989 and record demos. By Christmas 1989, though, Damon's contract with the Beat Factory had come to an end, and thus, Seymour unceremoniously dipped from the place that had given birth to them. They were alone, for now. Perchance, a 4-track demo made its way to one Andy Ross, who handed it over to his partner, David Balfe, who was an owner of EMI-funded indie-ish label Food Records. They were decently passionate about what they heard, but not immediately starstruck by the 4 lads. After attending a few of their pub gigs, Andy and Dave just kinda went, why not, and signed Seymour to Food Records. However, a stipulation was that since Seymour was sort of a lame name, a change was called for. Food gave them a sheet with a list of names to choose from, and from those, one was certainly chosen. Thus, the quartet were newly christened Blur.
I don't need anyone, but a little love make things better.
It's impossible to talk about what's to come without talking about what came before it, and in this case, one cannot go without mentioning Blur. Their career began with the release of 2 singles, their first ever, She's So High, which got to number 48 on the charts, and the second, There's No Other Way, which reached a high number 8 and became a hit, sending Blur into the London scene. Blur would collaborate with producer Stephen Street on the latter release, Stephen then being famed for working with the Smiths. Blur's debut album Leisure would release August 26th of 1991, and it is baggy Manchester shoegaze. So this is what Blur did before they turned British. An admirable stoned rose of an album, this features a decent collection of tracks from the group. It's clear that the 4 of them can make music together and overall share a unique chemistry. This is a pretty decent debut on Blur's end. Leisure managed to don the number 7 on UK charts, and while she charted high, the admirable album placement unfortunately hid mixed reviews, and Damon himself later admitted he doesn't particularly like this album.
We're Blur, and I'm Damon, and I'm the singer.
I'm Graham and I play the guitar.
I've got a big bass guitar and I'm called Alex.
I'm called Dave and I play the drums.
Despite being inducted into the scene that celebrates itself, Blur weren't completely satisfied with their first outing to the charts. Some could say they weren't at leisure with their product. The album felt completely scattershot to them in tone, and it felt like they weren't able to do what they wanted to do with it. 4 producing credits and a general want from their label to capitalize on the baggy sound left the album feeling varied in quality. And Blur only got into more of a slump as they discovered they were in serious debt. £60,000, so thanks, mismanagement. Luckily, Blur managed to charm themselves up up a bit at this point, and they had a little bit of help in order to get out. Whether it was the mismanagement they experienced at the time, or the general disinterest they had in the scene they were inducted to, Blur released a harsher new single titled Pop Scene, released March 30th of 1992. The sound is a departure from Leisure, featuring something that sounded a little more English in its punky guitars, sardonic commentary, and horns. Unfortunately, it failed to chart well, and critically it wasn't loved. This is arguably their best track to date, all the band members loved it, and it had to be the one that critics hated the most. Right, mismanagement. To pay this inane debt off, Blur committed to an obscenely large tour of the US to recover their losses. It seemed like a hopeless run, looking more and more like Blur would eventually morph into a Blur, lost in the past alongside the thousands of bands forgotten in the graveyard of music. This certainly was a low for Blur, but this tour changed everything. Nirvana had recently released their totally small and not at all hugely influential album Nevermind. You've probably never heard of it, and people around the world were trying to imitate the sound of American grunge, so no one was really interested in listening to indie poppy choruses from a group of no-salt British boys. Blur's '92 tour is now considered one of the most infamous in rock history, purely because of how negative the reception was to the English soundscapes. Misery from the performances, combined with homesickness, long nights driving down the barren American landscapes, and no recognition to their name in the States, resulted in Damon and the rest of Blur having long conversations of sorts regarding the influence of American culture on British music. Question: how do you combat American influence on your music? Because America sucks, don't look inside them. Answer: start penning songs related to Britain to create an English atmosphere. Damon and co. would draw from the influences they grew up with, alongside the sounds of English bands. The Kinks, the Beatles, The Who, The Specials, Human League, etc., etc. They also punched each other a lot. Once the tour was finally over, the band entered the studio and began to work. The result of sticking to this new idea of British sounds was their second album, Modern Life is Rubbish, a much more British pop sort of album, which only got to number 15 and failed to sell entirely well, and it was a little underwhelming for the time. It marks the beginning of Blur experimenting in the studio and making songs less accessible in favor of progress. The album consists of a tone comparable to the sound bands like were making at the time, but it's best not to mention in the same breath right now. Alas, London didn't seem to love them yet, and Blur's label considered it commercial suicide, chewing out the band for making a follow-up less accessible than their first. Modern Life is Rubbish only ended up selling 40,000 copies in the UK at the time, and an even smaller 19,000 in the US, with singles like Chemical World and Sunday Sunday charting in the top 30. But Blur, despite the negative feedback, were satisfied with the sound they achieved and went to work again. However, they were in trouble with their label, and Food Records were starting to worry a lot. Blur were already a financial risk with their last album. If this one flopped, then Blur were out of the game. It's important to emphasize just how high the stakes were here. Blur were a financial liability that Food had their tokens on. They needed a big hit from Blur just as much as Blur did. If not, then Blur would crash. Way back in 1990, Damon Albarn told a group of music journalists that his third album with Blur would cement them as a quintessential 90s English act, that he intended to write this album in 1994. April 25th, 1994 saw the release of Blur's third studio album. What they had done was take the sound of the previous record and expand on it with nothing short of some genius, making all of the ideas chase three-dimensional in their sound. And this record was dubbed Park Life. Park Life is an album so remarkably British. Its refusal to stick to a critical norm and ignoring pressure from various sources makes it an interesting listen. Considering the limited number of music magazines in the UK and the wide viewer base bestowed upon these articles, Blur instantly shot up from a semi-obscure, artsy-fartsy left-field band right into the public eye. This album has since gone on to be one of the defining albums of this new movement called Britpop, which was all about celebrating British culture through music, promoting British bands, selling music mags with music that was indeed pop. Blur was nothing short of a cultural phenomenon, appearing everywhere from the radio to magazines to the telly across 1994. They also attracted the attention of some up-and-coming band called Oasis, where the Gallagher brothers Noel and Liam said some funny things about Damon Albarn and Blur, and this created something called the Battle of Britpop. And also Damon Albarn's One Night. This media battle started as less than friendly jabs between bands reported on by tabloids that ended up as a war between the middle and lower classes and a whole cultural event pitting the north and south of England against each other. Not only did the limited music press hound over this story, but the reports started wiggling their way into actual mainstream news. This battle of British pop would come to a head when a conflict would be engaged between the two. Blur and Oasis would release a single single on the same day and see who could sell more copies. Well, really it was to see who could get to #1 on the charts first. B-Day came around on the 14th of August 1995, and both songs were released to the public, and these tunes both perfectly exemplify their respective bands. Blur released a single entitled Country House, a slightly more experimental and artsy portrait of a man living in his far-off home who slowly becomes more and more disillusioned with his middle-class life, showing the more London artsy commentary side of the band, while Oasis released the universal rock single Roll With It, a song about being true to yourself, rolling with the punches that life throws at you, showing their appeal to the general masses of England. The media hopped onto this craze and blew everything out of the water. Important political events were happening around the world, and they were replaced by coverage of the battle, interviewing random people outside of music shops and asking if they got Blur or Oasis. So, who exactly won? Well, Blur did, as Country House occupied their first #1 spot on the charts, with Oasis tagging along right behind, and this seemed to signify Blur's status as the better band, and Blur continued to dominate the radio waves around this time. In general, Blur were riding a tidal wave of fame, fortune, and glory. However, this battle would eventually lead to their loss. Blur decided to release their senior album, The Great Escape, and this album followed the same idea of talking about middle-class characters and stories with a tone a little more matured and subdued compared to Parklife, and of course the album saw great success, going to #1 in the UK charts. Critically, it was at first lauded as a worthy follow-up to Parklife, but this one had a little bit more lurking underneath the surface. It was very much a tragic commentary on the state of the band, the life of an average fellow in London, and Damon's overall mental health, as you can spot general themes of depression, isolation. Oasis released What's the Story Morning Glory, a less artsy, more rock-off-the-wall album, which had mixed great reviews. It went multi-platinum around the world and tapped into a place Blur could never really get into: the US. Granted, the album is quite good and is consistent across all boards in terms of musicianship, but compared to Blur, it's a much more simple formula that grants more success. It also became the 5th best-selling album from the UK of all time, with its name being next to albums like Sgt. Pepper's or bands like ABBA or Queen. The Battle of Britpop may have resulted in Oasis's loss, but they had gotten so much free publicity off of the whole ordeal, and alongside the humongous sales of this album, Oasis quickly became one of the most revered bands all over England and the rest of the world. Oh, right. Blur. Blur suck now. God. Screw Blur. Fuck Blur. Oasis are the revered working class saviors. Blur? Blur are artsy-fartsy, inauthentic middle-class gits. Great Escape? Mediocre album. Critics said it was great? That was a lot. Oasis also made some song about a wonderful wall or whatever, but that isn't relevant right now. What does matter is that Oasis beat Blur in the war, and Damon was down in the dumps. Blur became known as this inauthentic quartet and less revered than the more down-to-earth nature of Oasis, most likely because the media figured writing about Oasis would sell more papers. Damon felt stupid and confused. Blur had turned into the uncoolest band on the planet. Not only did it turn out that he wasn't satisfied with his latest album, but he just didn't understand how to be the face of one of the largest bands in the UK and deal with the constant attention, not being helped by the fact his mental health was not in the best spot at the moment. Blur came into 1996 with tensions growing rapidly between each other, and Coxon turned to American music to escape the now rapidly disinteresting Britpop world, which Damon also took interest in. Beck, Pavement. Britpop had ultimately gone commercial, so instead Blur settled upon making something fresh and unexpected, venturing to Iceland for some time to work in isolation, to take a breather from the chokehold of England. After many months of toil, their 1997 album Blur came back to a sound from a territory they wanted, American rock, and it proved successful despite the doubts of many, spawning another #1 single, Beetlebum, another #1 album, and their second single, Song 2, finally becoming Blur's first success in the US. The irony is not lost in the fact that Blur's biggest hit was, to this point, a style they had gotten big on by avoiding entirely. Blur's self-titled is completely different to their previous trilogy of Life albums. It's a mark of masterful musicianship to be able to shift one's sound into new territory, a telltale sign of a performer worth their salt. If your music doesn't evolve, you tend to fall into obscurity soon after you take center stage, and it's clear Damon and the rest of Blur weren't willing to leave the party just yet. Blur had managed to overcome its label of Britpop and outlast many of the other bands surrounding that mark with their creativity and ingenuity. However, this marked a dramatic change for Damon. He was tired of Blur, he was tired of the media, he was tired of the industry, he was tired of being the frontman, and on top of recently having a tragic breakup with his long-running girlfriend at the time, Justine Frischmann, he wanted something fresh and enjoyable, and it was around this time he began living with someone we mentioned a long time ago, Jamie Hewlett. Who is Jamie Hewlett, and what had he done while Damon was in Blur?
James Hewlett. He's just given me a friendship ban. We're officially friends.
My dad was an amazing artist, but he wasn't allowed to fulfill that dream, because I think his parents felt that being a cartoonist or an illustrator wasn't a proper job. I remember seeing his pictures on the wall at home when we were young, and he was really good. And he took us to see Star Wars in Leicester Square when it opened, and obviously I was completely, inspired by this film. So I started drawing my own Star Wars comics, and drawing pictures of Chewbacca, and that's when I started drawing.
Jamie Hewlett, like Damon, grew up liking art, but not necessarily music. Thanks to a mix of seeing Star Wars as a kid and reading Mad Magazine, he liked drawing comics, entering contests to make designs for stuff. Jamie was always destined for the art world in some way, and he ended up creating artwork for a show in 1983 that sadly never came to be. But Jamie had his heart set out on comics, and comics he did. While studying graphic design at Northbrook College Worthing, he made a fanzine called Atomtan with some buddies, notably Alan Martin and Philip Bond. Alan and Philip knew each other from a band they had been in together, and the three of them hit it off immediately. This fanzine was brought to the attention of Brett Owens, who later invited Jamie and Alan to a new magazine he was setting up called Deadline, and it was for Deadline alongside Alan Martin that he donned the pen for a creation of theirs titled Tank Girl, debuting in 1988. Tank Girl became quite the phenomenon, with its anarchic and absurdist punk style serving as an icon for a generation of rebellious and nerdy teens. A feminist counterculture zeitgeist used in punk rock circles to rebel served piping hot on Deadline magazine alongside 6 types of freeze-dried coffee. The comic and art style created a very unique tone. Jamie was certainly talented at his craft, and combined with the influence of made Tank Girl quite the trip. Jamie continued to draw comics alongside Tank Girl, notably Hooligan's Haircut, where getting a haircut results in reality breaking for the protagonist, but also comics like Judge Dredd, Hell City, and Doom Patrol. This level of fame shot Jamie into a rare spot of fame for a comic artist, making album covers, decor for Nightclub, and it was during his work for Deadline that he met Damon Albarn through Graham Coxon. At first they didn't get along, with impressions not going well. However, years later, Jamie would also be caught in a situation similar to Damon's. He was tired of working on Tank Girl, especially after an unsuccessful movie adaptation, only really made for monetary purposes. Alongside this, with the crash of the Deadline magazine, Jamie started making a new comic called Get the Freebies. This comic, created in collaboration with Matt Wakeham, is best described with actually reading it, but a general concept that keeps coming up is the idea of making fun of the industry it's set in. It takes jabs at everything with grotesquely witty dialogue. If you'd like to learn more about this series, like Damon, Jamie was also at ends with a long-lasting relationship, his being with Jane Oliver. He too wanted to do something better, something new. The bond Jamie and Damon shared led to the decision of living in a flat together, which strengthened their relationship. They'd throw outlandish parties with celebrities, and over the course of a year, Damon and Jamie started to resent their world more and more for all of the pain it had caused them. The media, the music industry, celebrity culture, everything that had come in their way of making art. It was all grating to the point of something more than just discontent. It was at this time Damon and Jamie were watching MTV, bored out of their minds and heckling what they saw on TV. It got to a point where one day, as their anger towards the industry boiled alongside the want to do something new, they evaluated how garbage it was. Boring. Repetitive. A burning bush of fake personality. Not the MTV that once was, but not quite the MTV that it was going to become. An awkward in-between of pop music. But gone were the days of MTV being the counterculture channel of creation, and in were the days of commercialized chart-topping plasticine acts, boy bands, girl groups, mass-manufactured acts of easy-to-digest throwaway music. But something had snapped this time, and they thought, you know what? I'll do it myself. If bands this fake can become this popular, why not make the most fake band of all time? One that isn't even real.
Good night, Sam.